As the deadline approached, the situation transformed from tense to critical. Military forces remained on alert. Diplomatic channels stayed open but strained. Every global player watched the same question unfold in real time. Would Iran finally say yes? Inside Pakistan, preparations reached their peak. The city was ready, the stage was set. Even a temporary agreement could change everything. Markets would stabilize, tensions could cool, and a pathway to peace might finally emerge. But without Iran, the entire structure collapsed before it even began. And still, no answer. Reports confirmed what many had begun to fear. Tehran had not made any decision to attend the talks. The silence had outlasted the pressure, the invitations, the urgency. It had become something stronger than all of them combined, Reuters' control. Because by refusing to rush, Iran had shifted the narrative. It was no longer the country being invited, it had become the country everyone was waiting for. The power dynamic had reversed, quietly but completely. Now the question was no longer, will Iran come? It had become, what happens if it never does? The world stood at the edge of two futures, one shaped by dialogue, the other by escalation. And somewhere in between, in a room that remained empty, history waited for a decision that still hadn't been spoken. Sometimes wars don't begin with explosions. Sometimes they begin with silence. The silence that once felt controlled began to feel dangerous. At first, the world had patience. Diplomats understood delay. Analysts called it strategy. But as days stretched longer, that patience began to fracture. Markets didn't wait for political decisions. Oil prices surged unpredictably, reacting not to action, but to the absence of it. Shipping routes adjusted overnight. Insurance premiums spiked. Every tanker that moved through contested waters now carried risk calculated not in numbers, but in uncertainty. Inside Pakistan, the mood shifted from preparation to anxiety. What was meant to be a historic diplomatic moment now hovered on the edge of becoming a public failure. Officials who once spoke with confidence began choosing their words carefully. Because the truth was simple. If Iran didn't come, the entire initiative would collapse, and Pakistan's role as a mediator would be questioned globally. Meanwhile, the three countries that had pushed Iran toward Islamabad began to feel the consequences of their own urgency. Back-channel communications intensified, messages grew sharper. What had once been framed as cooperation now carried subtle warnings. Economic leverage, strategic consequences, diplomatic isolation. The language didn't change openly, but its meaning did, and Iran noticed. Tehran had expected pressure, but not desperation. That shift revealed something critical. It meant the stakes were even higher than expected. It meant the other side needed this meeting more than Iran did. And in geopolitics, that realization is power. So instead of moving closer to the table, Iran stepped further back. Because sometimes the strongest move is not advancing forward, but forcing everyone else to chase you. Behind the public silence, something far more complex was unfolding. This was no longer just about whether Iran would attend talks in Pakistan. It had become a deeper contest, one involving influence, alliances, and the future shape of the region. Quietly, other powers began repositioning themselves, not through headlines, but through actions that barely made the news. China, watching from the background, maintained its calculated calm. It didn't rush Iran. It didn't echo the urgency of others. Instead, it observed. Because for Beijing, this situation presented opportunity. Every delay weakened Western influence slightly. Every failed negotiation increased the value of alternative partnerships. Silence, once again, was not absence, it was calculation. Russia, too, remained strategically distant, supportive but careful. It understood that this moment wasn't just about Iran or Pakistan. It was about testing how far pressure could go before resistance hardened into defiance, and Iran was becoming the center of that test. Meanwhile, within Iran itself, internal discussions grew more intense. Leaders debated not whether to attend, but under what conditions attendance would make sense, because showing up too early could signal weakness. Showing up too late could risk escalation. Timing, more than anything, had become the weapon. And then came the realization that changed everything. This wasn't a negotiation about peace. It was a negotiation about control over the future. Every country involved wanted stability, but on its own terms. And Iran, by refusing to move, was forcing everyone to reveal what those terms truly were. The world wasn't watching talks anymore. It was watching a silent power struggle unfold in real time. There comes a moment in every crisis where silence stops being strategy and starts becoming risk. That moment had arrived. Military movements, once described as precautionary, began to look more permanent. Naval forces adjusted positions. Airspace monitoring intensified. Each side claimed it was defensive, but the pattern told a different story. Preparation was turning into readiness. And still, Iran had not answered. Inside Pakistan, urgency reached its peak. Diplomatic channels worked nonstop, trying to salvage what remained possible. The vision of peace talks had not disappeared, but it was fading, slowly, quietly, like something slipping out of reach. The three countries that once urged Iran forward now faced a new reality. They had run out of time to wait, because pressure, when it fails, does not simply disappear. It transforms. The narrative in global media began to shift. Iran was no longer being invited. It was being blamed. The tone hardened. Questions turned into accusations. And with that shift, the space for diplomacy began to shrink. Tehran understood this pattern well. It had seen it before. And that's why its silence remained unbroken, because stepping into talks under rising blame could reshape the entire outcome before negotiations even began. It would mean entering the room already positioned as the obstacle, not the equal. So Iran waited, and the world moved closer to a line no one wanted to cross, a line where decisions would no longer be made in meeting rooms, but in moments that could not be reversed. The final question was no longer about Pakistan. It was about whether diplomacy itself had already failed. And if it had, then the silence that started everything might become the reason everything changes. The waiting did not end with an answer. It ended with a shift. Without warning, the tone across global capitals changed. The quiet patience that had defined the past days disappeared overnight. Statements became firmer, movements became faster. What had once been described as holding position was now openly called readiness. Something had broken, not publicly, not dramatically, but enough for everyone involved to feel it. Inside Pakistan, the realization settled in like a heavy fog. The talks might never happen. Rooms prepared for negotiation remained untouched. Schedules designed down to the minute became irrelevant. The vision of leaders sitting across from each other, exchanging words instead of warnings, began to feel like something from a different timeline. And yet, Pakistan did not step back. It continued reaching out, pushing quietly, refusing to let the door close completely. But outside that door, the world had already started moving on. The three countries that once urged Iran forward began activating alternatives. Contingency plans, once hidden deep within classified discussions, were brought forward. Economic countermeasures, strategic alliances, military coordination, not actions of war, but not actions of peace either. And Iran watched, because this was the moment Tehran had been waiting for, the moment where pressure transformed into exposure. Now, intentions were no longer hidden behind diplomacy. They were visible, measurable, undeniable. And in that visibility, Iran found clarity. The question was no longer whether to attend talks. It was whether talks were ever truly the goal. Then, finally, something happened. Not a confirmation, not a refusal, a message. It didn't come through official speeches or global broadcasts. It came quietly, through diplomatic channels, through statements carefully crafted to reveal just enough and nothing more. Iran had spoken, but not in the way anyone expected. The message was simple yet powerful. Dialogue is possible, but not under pressure. That single line changed everything, because it wasn't a yes and it wasn't a no, it was a condition. For the first time, the silence had direction. Iran wasn't rejecting talks. It was redefining the rules of engagement. Remove the pressure, step back from escalation, create space for genuine negotiation, and then maybe the conversation could begin. But the world immediately understood the difficulty of that demand. Pressure had already become the language of this crisis. Military positioning, economic threats, strategic warnings, none of these could simply disappear overnight. To remove them would mean stepping back without guarantees. It would mean trusting an outcome that no one could control. And trust was exactly what was missing. Inside Pakistan, the message sparked a fragile sense of renewed possibility. It wasn't the answer they had hoped for, but it was not the silence they feared. It meant the door was still open, even if only slightly. But for the three countries pushing hardest, it created a dilemma. Do they step back and risk losing leverage, or continue forward and risk losing diplomacy entirely? For the first time since the crisis began, the pressure was no longer one-sided. Now, everyone was being tested. Everything now depended on what happened next. The situation had reached a rare and dangerous balance where both action and inaction carried equal risk. Move too aggressively, and the fragile possibility of talks would collapse. Step back too quickly, and control over the situation could slip away entirely. Global leaders faced a choice they could not delay any longer. Inside war rooms and diplomatic offices, strategies were rewritten in real time. Some argued for de-escalation, pull back, reduce pressure, create the conditions Iran demanded. Others warned that doing so would signal weakness, encouraging further resistance, not just from Iran, but from others watching closely, because the world was watching. Allies, rivals, neutral states. Every country observing this crisis was learning something about power, pressure, and patience. The outcome here would not stay contained. It would echo far beyond the region, and in the center of it all, Pakistan remained the stage. A place that had almost become the turning point of history. A place that still could, if the right decision was made at the right moment. But time was no longer unlimited. Every hour without resolution increased the risk of miscalculation. A single movement misread, a single signal misunderstood, and the entire situation could shift from controlled tension to irreversible escalation. Iran had made its position clear. The world had revealed its intentions. Now, the final step belonged to everyone, not just one country, not just one decision, but a collective choice between two paths, one that required patience, restraint, and risk, and another that required none of those things at all. Because the easiest path forward is often the one that leads to conflict. And as the world stood at that crossroads, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just a political crisis. It was a moment that would define how power is used in the modern world.